The Sunday Times have just published the 2023 edition of the Sunday Times Rich List. The thing is, I've scanned through the list and I can't see your name in it. So what is it that you need to do to get into the list for next year and have a gaff just like the one behind me? Thanks, Saj. So the list has now been published. It's official. Get into the list. You need to be worth a bare £500,000. Now, the interesting thing is, if we look at an earlier publication, this one's from 30 years ago, and actually the current list is 35 years old now, so it's the 35th edition. You needed to be worth a mere £20 million to make it into the list. So isn't it interesting? Over 30 years, it's gone from where you had to be worth at least £20 million to now close to £500 million to get into the list. So how is it people even make it into this list? So let's talk some numbers. If we look at the typical salary in this country, for most people, they're on about £32,000 a year. That's an average salary. You might be on more than that, lucky you, or you may be on less than that. That's typical salary. Now, when we think about what it takes to get into the top 5% in terms of income earners in this country, you may be surprised to know it's about £100,000. Well, actually, that's only probably 3 times the average salary. But then to get into the top 1%, you're earning about £15,000 a month, which equates about £180,000 a year. That's the top 1% of earners in this country. Now, we're not talking about wealth. Now, we're talking about income right now. So £180,000, that's more than the Prime Minister of this country, because they're on about 150 grand a year. So even the Prime Minister of this country earns less than this. It's probably about £165,000 a year. But the question is, how do you go from this to mega wealth? So as I said, about £15,000 a month will put you in the top 1% of earners in this country. When we talk about that in the context of property, there are many people that earn more than £10,000 a month from property. If you just think about HMOs or service accommodation, one of these high cash flow type strategies, that will generate typically about £800 to £1,000 a month. Then I'm sure there's people you probably know that have got more than 10 properties that are generating more than £1,000 a month. That's straight away putting you into a £10,000 category. Now, to get that £15,000 isn't that difficult, because it's about scaling an existing business. Now, although what we're talking about here is income, what we're really interested in this video is wealth. Wealth is completely different, because that's the asset value that you have. That's the worth, as opposed to the income, because the income can be very different from what your wealth is. And when we look at these telephone number size wealth that people have, it's how is it that they get to those numbers? So the wealthiest people on the list, the Hinduja brothers, they're worth about 35 billion, up from about 28 billion last year. So they're worth a few more billion from last year. So when you start getting to these bigger numbers, continuing to grow from there is not so difficult for them. So what is it that enables them to get to those kind of numbers in the first place? Well, the common denominator is business. It's assets that they own, it's shares in businesses that they own, or it's often the disposal of a business that's given them a major liquidity event, i.e. they've sold some shares, they've sold a business that's given them a large amount of money. Sometimes it may be inherited, it might be family money that's been handed down. Sometimes it may be money that they've made from property. But many people that have made money from businesses also invest and keep it in property. And that's really what got me interested in the Sunday Times Rich List and got me thinking about property about 17 years ago. But as I said, I've been a fan of the Rich List literally from the first publication in 1989, which is when I got started in business. At that time, I was really looking just to be inspired. Why is it that enables people to create this kind of wealth? And even the entry 20 million was just like a telephone number at the time, just thinking about that number for me in terms of the entry number to get into a list like that. But it's the inspiration you get from understanding how people have built these businesses and why they're worth so much money. And often it's businesses that are scalable. So if somebody's selling a service or a product to somebody, it needs to be able to scale massively to be able to build substantial wealth. If you're selling products to a small number of people, you're never going to be able to scale that into a £1 billion business. The £1 billion businesses are those that can scale and reach many, many people and have a product or a service that is used and accessed by many billions of people. That's where the valuation comes from. Here's an interesting fact. One of the first pages that you flick open to in this edition, you've got Bob Bull and Sarah Nielsen. Now, they've jumped the second highest new entry into the Rich List, and they are bungalow builders or property developers, and they've gone from bankrupt to billionaires in 7 years. Now, the reason I picked this story, not only is it so inspiring and I love reading stories like this, but it's what's possible First of all, is having a mindset of how can you do this as opposed to, oh, it's okay for them. And at the end of the day, I believe that we're on this planet for a limited period of time, and we've got one chance at life, and God has blessed us all with the same 24 hours of the day and a brain between our ears. Ultimately, it's up to us how we choose to use it, how we choose to apply ourselves, and what we choose to do with our time. So when we look at inspirational stories like this of what people achieved, it's what can we take from them, what learning can we take there? And often the most common thing that I see and hear from, and when I get an opportunity to spend time with amazingly successful people, when I talk about financially successful people, is that they are grafters. They work very hard. They are very productive. They think about systems. They think about scale in terms of how to build. So it's thinking about bigger picture. If you've followed Grant Cardone at all, if you might hate him, you might love him, it might be a bit of a Marmite effect. But the idea that he has about 10x, about putting a zero on the end of everything, 10xing your thinking, your thought pattern, whatever you're thinking right now. So if you're on £32,000 a year, how do you go from 32 to £332,000? How do you put a zero on the end of what you're doing already? How can you think bigger? Now, here's the thing. You may not hit that target, but you may get close to it. But either way, you'll probably get significantly further than you currently are. And that's the thing we need to think about. Another interesting one for me is Lord Sugar. He's 165th in terms of position, worth just over £1 billion. Now, his fortunes really come from property, although we've seen him as a tech and kind of IT background. Literally, when I was starting out back in 1989 in business, and the rich list had just come out at that time, there were a few people that we could look to and be inspired by as kind of your true influencers and business influencers at the time. So we had Richard Branson and we had Lord Sugar. And I'd follow Lord Sugar's journey because he was also in a computing background, and that's kind of where I started. So I was really interested in his journey and what he'd done. But the real amazing thing is most of his wealth has come from property, and he sold about £100 million of property over the last year. So probably cashing in on some of the growth that's happening in the marketplace. So it's a fascinating read, and I like to keep all these editions, and the reason, as I said earlier on, I find it really inspiring. Reading people's stories, what's created their wealth, how they've done that, what markets that they've grown in, and which markets are struggling as well. And even times like we've got recessionary times now happening, you still got huge amounts of growth. So I'd love to know who you think should have been in the list that's not in the list this year. Remember, it's shrunk down to only 300 people now, so it's a smaller list than it has been in the past. Pop in the comment section below, and I look forward to seeing your name in the list this time next year in the 2024 edition.